Good morning.
Good morning.
This northern air is making my voice a bit flaky, so excuse me.
Chair, our first witness today is Mrs. Carol Edmondson.
Good morning, Miss Edmondson.
Good morning.
Over to you, Miss Kennedy.
Good morning, Miss Edmondson. I'm Jane, the usher, that's going to swear you in this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
If I could ask you to hold the Bible in your right hand, and if you could repeat the following after me, please.
Yes.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. As I think you know, my name's Ruth Kennedy and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you state your name, please?
Carol Edmondson.
And have you got a copy of your witness statement there?
Yes, I have.
I think it should be dated the 8th of January 2022. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that your signature on page 12?
Yes, it is.
Have you read through this statement recently?
Yes,
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
it is.
I'm going to start by asking a couple of introductory questions about you. How old are you now?
I'm just turned 70 in December gone.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Goulburn near Warrington, where I still live.
What did you do after finishing school?
I went to college and I studied accountancy and maths. And then I got a job in a wages office of a local company that made seating for cinemas.
When did you start working for the post office?
After I'd had my family, I got a part-time job in our local post office, and that was in 1978. That was in the Wigan area, yeah.
And how long did you work there part-time?
I worked there until 1984 when I took my first post office on myself.
And which post office did you decide to take on yourself?
Well, even though I'd been working in a very busy post office in Wigan, I thought it would be sort of better to start off smaller. So I took a rural office in the outskirts of Tarporley, Cheshire, a little place called Dudden.
And why that shop specifically?
Well, at the time, my husband was looking for a different vacation as well. And the shop itself was, although in a village, was very busy. It was open from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. So he came into the business with me. I was the Subpost mistress and he worked on the retail side of the shop.
And how did you like working for the post office then?
Oh, it was fine. The people were lovely. The job was fine. I wouldn't have gone into my own business if I hadn't enjoyed working as a part-time assistant in Wigan. I wouldn't have entertained that, but I took to the job so well and I enjoyed it so much. That's why I ventured into my own business as a Subpost mistress.
How long did you run that particular post office for?
From 84 until 88.
Which post office did you go to next?
I moved on then back towards, back in the Wigan area, and I took a bigger post office then, and I moved into St Helens, Robbins Lane post office.
And can you describe that business that you had at Robbins Lane?
It was very busy. It was a 3-counter position, smaller retail side with no groceries and things like that, and no newspapers, but still very busy. And we were kept, yeah, it was a very busy time. We were kept going. We were kept busy.
How many staff did you have?
I had 3 staff on the post office side with me and 1 staff on the retail side as well.
And I think you say in your statement that Horizon came in during your time as sub-postmistress at Robbins Lane, is that right?
It did.
What computer system accounting did you use prior to Horizon coming in?
Well, at first, I used to just use a normal adding machine, like we all did, to add up all the pension dockets. It was pension books at that time. And then later on, I purchased my own computer system, the Edward Jackson system for Subpost offices. And I worked on that one.
What training did you receive on Horizon when it was introduced?
I remember going to a local hotel with some other sub-postmasters, and we had roughly around 2.5 days.
How useful did you find that training?
The actual balancing side of the training was very lacking. The concentration was more on the running of the computer, how to install paper rolls and things like that, you know, like the technical side of it, you could say. The actual training on the system itself was very lacking.
How did you find Horizon to use in comparison to the previous systems?
More complicated. I don't think it had been designed by anyone that had stood behind a post office counter.
And how soon after the installation of Horizon did you start to notice shortfalls?
Well, not very long into the system. And of course, with being new, I thought, well, there's something I'm doing wrong here.
And what use, if any, would you make of the helpline?
Very little use. We would ring for help Wednesday evenings when I could see that things weren't right. And it was as if you were just given a time slot because, I mean, little did we know there were so many people in the same boat. So they gave us a time slot of about 5 minutes. And if they couldn't resolve it, which they couldn't, and then they left us to our own devices.
What types of sums in terms of discrepancies or shortfalls did you start to notice?
Some weeks I would be lucky and it wasn't very much, say about 20, 30 pounds. Other weeks it would go into 100, 150. I could never, we would never know how much it was going to be.
What would you do to correct the shortfalls or to remove them from the system?
We had to make them good, as was put down by the post office in the wording of when the Horizon system was put into operation. And shortfalls were to be made good.
How much money do you estimate that you paid to the post office to make good those shortfalls?
Over the term that it was in until I managed to sell the office in 2010, I've assumed around £30,000.
Was there anyone else that you reported your difficulties with Horizon to other than the helpline?
Well, at that time I was a Federation member and I went to Federation meetings and I used to voice the fact that I'd had a bad balance the week before or I was having bad balances and people would comment that they were the same, but we never found out, even in the Federation, a way of help.
And were these meetings local federation meetings or area meetings or even national meetings that you're now talking about?
They were local meetings, and then we would move on then to area meetings as well.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
What was your experience of audits?
Well, the auditors used to arrive before the post office opened, and they used to go in with us as we unlocked, and then they would take over and they would audit the office. And if there were any discrepancies, we weren't allowed to audit then or look into the system ourselves. We just had to accept what the auditors found. If there was a discrepancy, of course, before they left, we were expected to make that good.
How did you feel treated by the auditors?
Well, they weren't helpful at all. If I asked them questions as to why the Horizon system was wanting, they didn't answer any questions regarding that. They were only interested in what they found on the day, in coming in, doing what they had to do, and going.
What other problems did you have with Horizon?
One of the problems that I found was the issuing of foreign currency at that time. The post office were getting involved a lot more into issuing of foreign currency, and the Horizon system just could not cope with that at all. I knew if I'd had transactions for foreign currency in that particular trading week, I knew on the Wednesday night that the system would be faulting and I would be probably down and having to put money in. I would ring the helpline about it. I would inquire as to what the rate was for the currency involved at that time, and I would recheck and recheck. But I always knew if I'd done foreign currency transactions, I would have a problem.
You mentioned a moment ago that you sold your post office in 2010. Why did you decide to resign from your position?
I couldn't have carried on. I couldn't have carried on. It was not sustainable. I was the main breadwinner by that time, and the post office was not sustaining the family.
Do you mean financially?
Financially.
I'm now going to ask you some questions about the impact that this has had on you. Other than the shortfalls, which I think you mentioned you put money into the post office to make good, what other financial impacts has this had on you?
Well, I found that there were many weeks that I couldn't take a wage for myself because over the period of time having to sustain putting the shortfalls, the shortages in, it was chipping away at any profit that had been made on the shop. Of course, I had wages to pay for the girls, but I couldn't pay myself. I was living with my elderly father was living with me at the time, and unfortunately there were times when regularly I had to go to him for help, which I didn't like doing. It was embarrassing. At my time of life, I should have been helping him, not him resorting to having to help me to carry on.
What impact did that have on your family?
Well, of course, there was a spin-off on my son and daughter who were still living with me then. It was just causing stress within the family. The fact that I was so worried about the situation all the time.
What about the impact on your health?
I became really, really stressed over the situation, and I developed very bad IBS symptoms. Wednesday night, my stomach would be churning, and so much so the pain that was involved, I finished up being sent to a consultant at Wigan Infirmary because it was suspected that it could possibly be other things. So after tests and the results came back that it was chronic IBS brought on by stress.
What about the impact that all of this has had on your relationship with your husband?
We separated 3 years into moving to Hindley.
What would you like from the post office now?
I would like recognition of the fact that this is just not a one-off situation, that there are other people, so many other sub-postmasters who have experienced the same problems at the time, though we were all meant to believe that we were alone in this. We were all led to believe it was just us. It was something we were doing wrong on a regular basis, and it could not possibly be this infallible, super-duper system that they had put in for us that was at fault. I would like the recognition regarding that from the post office. I would like people to realise what sub-postmasters have gone through. And I would like the path of justice to be taken so that the truth will win out in the end for all those who have suffered. That's all we're asking for, the truth.
Is there anything else you'd like to say to the chair?
I'd just like to thanks for being able to give this witness statement. I would like to be able to move forward with justice. And this is what we all look for. We don't want anything else but the justice in this and the truth, and so that every sub-postmaster can be repaid what they rightfully deserve and what they've lost over time. And that's all we're asking.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions for you. Chair, do you have any questions?
Just one. In your witness statement, you mentioned that you took part in a mediation in 2013, but nothing came of that. Could you just tell me a bit about that process, please?
Well, it was just an inquiry as to what had happened and how I'd felt over the Horizon system. And then it moved on to the post office, just questions similar to how the Horizon system had worked and the impact. It was just...
But did it get to the point in time where, for example, not the point in time, did it get to the point where, for example, you set out what losses you thought Horizon had caused you?
No, I never got to that.
You never got even to that
I
point?
never got to that.
All right.
No, I never got to that.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Edmondson, thank you very much for taking the time and trouble to come and give evidence to us this morning. Many people will have heard me thank people in your position for doing that, and I extend my thanks personally to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Wynne.
Chair, I think we're now going to have some witness statement summaries read by Ms.
Yes.
Patrick.
Yeah. Do you want us to disappear for a minute or two to get yourself ready, or are you actually ready, Ms. Patrick? Fine? Great. Thank you. I think in total, Ms. Patrick, you have 15 summaries to read in. So in order to break up the process, perhaps I'd suggest that you read 7 or 8 of them, and then I think it's your client who's giving evidence next, so we could take that evidence and see where we go from there.
Sir, thank you for that guidance. My name's Angela Patrick. I read summaries on behalf of the clients represented as core participants in the inquiry by Hudgell solicitors. And the full statements, we understand, sir, are with the inquiry.
Yes.
And the summaries are only a brief snippet of their story and of their experiences.
Yeah.
And we start with a summary of the evidence of Mr. Gregory Charles Harding. Mr. Harding and his wife bought the Hipper Home post office, and he was postmaster there between 2004 and 2009. When Mr. Harding noticed shortfalls, they were small at first, perhaps £5 here or there. He was just topping it up with the takings from the retail side of the business. The shortfalls then increased to £10 here or there, which then increased further. When the total shortfall reached £1,000, Mr. Harding called the helpline. He says, "They told me not to worry and that they would put it in the suspense account and allow me to balance." The following month, Horizon was down £2,000. Mr. Harding phoned the helpline again, but this time they told him that he should pay this himself. Mr. Harding tried to keep the business going, but the shortfalls continued to rise dramatically. He and his wife decided to remortgage their house with the hope of making some improvements to their home, but instead the majority of this money was used to meet shortfalls. He subsequently remembers settling 2 further shortfalls of at least £2,500 each. On the 30th of September 2009, an audit was conducted and it identified a shortfall in the region of £20,000. Following that audit, he was suspended. He says, "I couldn't believe it. I had to keep pinching myself. I told the auditors I hadn't taken the money. It was beyond belief. I couldn't even describe to anyone what it was really like." He says now, "I still get stressed now thinking about it all. I'm used to that stress. I don't class it as an illness. It was just part of my life and had become normal." He goes on to explain he was charged with theft following his suspension. He was interviewed on the 6th of October 2009, and there were 2 members of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters present at the interview. Of the interview, he says, "They tried to grind me down and trip me up, which they couldn't because I was telling the truth. I had no idea where that money could have gone." Mr. Harding recalls he received his court summons on his wife's birthday. After his suspension, his former post office was ram-raided, and people locally thought he was responsible. He remembers they shouted at him. saying, "Haven't you stolen enough?" He says it was horrible. He found himself constantly living with a bitter feeling and a feeling of, what have I done wrong? He says, I really didn't know who I could trust. My mental health was really suffering at this time. Ultimately, he was offered a plea deal by the post office and, on the advice of his legal team, pleaded guilty and was given a suspended sentence and ordered to undertake 200 hours of unpaid work. He had to sell the post office and the retail business to pay the shortfall prior to his conviction. After a period of unemployment post-conviction, he secured a job doing welding. And he felt doing this, he says, like he was a fish out of water. His reputation in the community was lost, and he recalls while shopping at the supermarket, he would be called names. He recalls people threw eggs at his car. He wants the inquiry to know that he and his wife are very close and helped each other through the tough times. But he says, for a time after my conviction, I struggled to enjoy family occasions like birthdays and Christmas. I didn't feel happy. Revisiting that time for Mr. Harding, he says, is still very difficult, and he says he suffered from periods of depression. He wants to say to the inquiry that he will never forget what happened to him and to his family. Chair, next we have a summary of the evidence of Miss Allison Hall, and Miss Hall is actually present here today, Sir Williams. Sir Wim.
Don't worry about me. Nice to see that you're present.
Allison Hall began working for the post office as a sub-postmaster at the Hightown branch on 16th February 2005. In April 2010, she applied for and was approved to take over a second disused branch in Robertstown. The plan had been for her daughter to run that branch, with Miss Hall splitting her time between the two. On the 28th of August 2010, Miss Hall had a visit from a member of staff from the post office coming to update the Horizon system. Miss Hall then told that agent she'd received approximately 36 transaction correction slips and that the system was showing a shortfall of £13,000. Miss Hall was relieved that someone had come who could help her to rectify the system. Instead, Miss Hall was told to close the post office immediately. She was audited in September 2010 and suspended. She appealed her suspension but was terminated on Christmas Eve 2010. She was then summoned to appear at Batley and Dewsbury Magistrates Court, charged with theft, and then to appear at the Leeds Crown Court. Miss Hall says she had evidence to prove there was no shortfall, and says she was frustrated and angry at every step because no one was prepared to look at her evidence. At court, Miss Hall was told that if she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, she would avoid prison. She felt pressured to accept the advice of her legal team. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of false accounting to avoid a full trial and the probability of a custodial sentence. Miss Hall was ordered to perform 120 hours of community service. She was subject to a confiscation order for £14,842.57 and ordered to pay costs in the sum of £1,000. Miss Hall's conviction was overturned on 23rd April 2021. She no longer felt, following her conviction, that she could be an active member of her community. She withdrew from all community activities. She wants to say her daughter suffered financially too, as she was going to be running that new branch at Robertstown. Miss Hall has suffered problems with her mental health because of this injustice, and she's recently been assessed by a counsellor and recommended to have 15 sessions of cognitive behavioural therapy. She adds that she had employed family members and friends to work in her post office and her shop. She was no longer able to work there, and she could not keep all of her team working the hours they'd had previously. She was forced to reduce hours or let people go. Relationships became very strained, and this was extremely stressful. The experience changed who she was. She says this was very difficult. She wants the inquiry to know, she says, she always felt as though she was an important member of our local community and enjoyed helping whenever possible. She adds, I'd lived in the area for most of my life and spent the last, more than 10 years actively participating in that community life. She goes on, my mother died in September 2020, and she died without knowing that I was not a criminal and that I had done nothing wrong. She wants the inquiry to know, nothing can undo what me and my family have been subjected to. I can only hope that this inquiry makes findings and recommendations that are taken on board, and organisations like the Post Office learn lessons to ensure that law-abiding citizens such as me do not have to face such an injustice again.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you,
again,
Chair.
thank you for coming, Ms Hall.
Next, Chair, we move to a summary of the evidence of Mr. Kyamishak. Kyamishak began work as a sub-postmaster of the Birkinshaw branch of the Post Office on the 15th of July 2008. His contract terminated on 14th February 2011. He had a number of issues from the very start with Horizon. Each time he found an error or a shortfall, he would contact the helpline to let them know. Each time, he says, he would have the amount taken out of his salary to cover the cost. The Post Office undertook a formal audit on the 8th of February 2011. The shortfall amount identified was £21,168.64. Mr. Ishaq disputed these figures. He was prosecuted by the Post Office for theft, and he was told by his barrister he would be unable to raise Horizon in his defence. Mr. Ishaq recalls the judge also told him Horizon could not be discussed. Mr. Ishaq felt he had no option other than to plead guilty. On the 22nd of April 2013, he was sentenced to 54 weeks immediate imprisonment for theft. By the time of his conviction, he had not been able to pay back the shortfall. He was in Armley prison for 3 months. He says he knew he was in the same prison as rapists and murderers. He remembers feeling watched by other people, and he says he did not know who they were or why they were there. In prison, he saw acts of violence and did not sleep properly. He says, I did not know if I would wake up. His conviction was overturned on 23rd April 2021. Following his release, Mr. Ishaq says he struggled to find work. He says, my whole personality changed as a result of my conviction. He says he has been diagnosed as suffering a depressive disorder and is told that it is likely to be something that will affect him for the rest of his life. He says publicity around his conviction brought shame on his family as a whole. Due to the stigma, he stopped going to pray and only prayed at home. His children were aged 3, 5, and 7 at the time of his conviction, and their family told them that he had just gone on holiday to protect them from the truth. Mr. Ishaq's father became ill whilst he was in prison and had to have his leg amputated. Mr. Ishaq says, I wasn't there for him. I felt like I'd let him down massively. He says his father took the conviction very hard as he was a religious man, and he passed away in 2018 before Mr. Ishaq's conviction was overturned. Mr. Ishaq also wants the inquiry to know his brother gave up time and effort to help him and his family. He wants to say he will never be able to forgive the post office. Next, we move to the summary of the evidence of Mr. Nicholas Clarke. Before he became a sub-postmaster, Nicholas Clarke had been a postman for 10 years. His mum was the sub-postmistress at Barrow upon Humber branch, and he took on a role as a counter clerk. He and his mum ran the shop and the post office effectively together as partners. He became sub-postmaster himself in November 2005. He started to use the helpline less as time went by because they couldn't help him resolve the issues he was experiencing. He did not continue to report shortfalls and accepted that as they happened, he must make them good, as he was under the belief they must be caused by human error. Following an audit in March 2009, a shortfall in the sum of around £7,500 was found. During that audit, he said, he personally covered an estimated £4,500 shortfall. He says he was told he was the only person they had ever come across who had had an issue with Horizon. Mr. Clarke suspected that there must have been an issue with the IT system and immediately pointed to the unreliability of Horizon. He says, after the audit, he burst into tears when he received a summons in the summer of 2009. He says, it felt surreal. He was charged with theft towards the end of that year, and prior to his trial, Mr. Clarke's legal team informed him that the post office wanted to offer him a plea bargain. He was told theft would be dropped if he pleaded guilty to false accounting. Having been advised this would likely result in him being less likely to receive a custodial sentence, Mr. Clarke opted to plead guilty. Plead guilty. It was a difficult decision at the time because he wanted to fight to prove his innocence. But at the same time, the hope of not going to prison was such that he really had no choice. On 23rd February 2010, he was given a 6-month sentence, suspended for 2 years and 150 hours of community service. Since his conviction, Mr. Clarke has become a recluse and does not wish to be seen in the local community. Whenever he goes out, he ensures it's either at night when it's dark or he goes to a different village or town so that he's not recognised. After his conviction, he visited his local GP as he was struggling with the repercussions of the negative and often inaccurate way he was being portrayed in the media, and he was prescribed medication for anxiety. Mr. Clarke says his mental health has been seriously impacted since his conviction. Prior to this, he was a fairly reserved person who sometimes lacked confidence, but he had a well-paid job with no significant history of mental health issues. When Mr. Clarke first received his summons, he says he suffered suicidal thoughts and twice considered taking his own life. To this day, he still suffers from anxiety when appearing in his local community. He's been diagnosed with PTSD, severe depression, and severe anxiety, and it's been recommended that he undergo a course of counselling. He'd like the inquirer to know his relationship with his brother has also deteriorated to the point they've not spoken since. Mr. Clarke says he thought that he ruined everyone's lives as well as his own. Thank you, Chair. The next statement is the summary of the statement of Mohammed Rasool. Mohammed Rasool was born in Pakistan and emigrated to the UK in 1964. He married in 1977 and had 3 daughters and a son. In 1985, he was offered the position of postal officer working behind a counter at the post office. In 1990, he moved from the counter to the back office. In 1997, an area manager asked if he would like to run the local Subpost office. He became sub-postmaster of the Tootle Drive post office in March 1997. He initially experienced some small, unexplained shortfalls, which he would cover with his own money. But by 2004, those shortfalls had grown much larger. In late 2004, he experienced a large shortfall of around £12,000. He could not afford to pay this. He called the helpline, but they were not helpful. In March 2005, there was an audit carried out along with his area manager present. Mr. Rizzo was suspended on the spot and says he was shocked and horrified. He'd been given the impression he was the only sub-postmaster having issues with the Horizon system. Mr. Rizzo approached his union, who we understand to explain was the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, but he was told that if Horizon said the money was missing, then the money was missing. He had to visit his GP as he was struggling to sleep due to the situation, and his ability to concentrate significantly declined. He says he found himself feeling worthless and hopeless and wishing he was dead. Following a brief suspension, his contract was terminated and he was charged with theft and false accounting in 2006. He was summoned to Salford Magistrates Court in July 2006 and he pleaded not guilty. He says, as I'd done nothing wrong. His case was transferred to Manchester Crown Court. An initial hearing was adjourned on the 8th of May 2007, and he was charged with an additional 40 offences of theft and false accounting. He wants the inquiry to know he could not imagine having to leave his family and to go to prison. After receiving legal advice and an assessment from a psychologist, he decided to plead guilty to 22 counts of theft. He was sentenced at Manchester Crown Court and received a 100-hour community service order, a 3-month curfew, and was required to wear an electronic tag and ordered to pay £500 in court costs. He was also forced to pay all unexplained shortfalls back to the post office. Mr. Rizzo wants to tell the inquiry that he had to submit a request for his curfew hours to be varied, as the curfew would have included the 3 months which coincided with Ramadan. This was agreed and varied to allow him to attend the mosque for prayer, but it meant that his curfew was then extended by a further 3 months. In July 2007, Mr. Rizzo was diagnosed with depression and PTSD, and at its worst, he felt feelings of suicide. He wants the inquiry to know that thoughts of his family and his religion stopped him going through with that. He says he felt constant guilt, and if anything went wrong, he immediately accepted responsibility. His sleep continued to be disturbed with vivid dreams and nightmares 3 or 4 times every month following his conviction. As to the financial impact, he was unable to obtain a loan, could not open a bank account, and his insurance premiums increased. He recounts one particular issue for the inquiry. His curfew was due to be over on the 19th of February 2008. His father passed away on 13th February 2008. He was not able to see his father in the last hours of his life. He was also unable to arrange or to assist in arranging his burial. He will never forget this. It is still incredibly upsetting. Mr. Rizzo talks about his wife and the impact upon her. He gives detail of some impacts on her health, and Mr. Rizzo says that he believes that these impacts on her were due to the stress that she was under, all caused by his conviction. He says, "It was horrible having to tell his loved ones about the dreadful experiences he went through." He says his youngest daughter struggled at university because she was so worried about him and her mum, whilst he was going through the court proceedings. He has to ask his eldest daughter to fund his youngest daughter's law degree, which he now carries tremendous guilt about. Of his own health, he says in 2015 he had a triple heart bypass, and he's also, since his conviction, developed asthma. In his view, he thinks these impacts were in part due to the stress of the situation with the post office. Finally, Mr. Razoul's mum passed away in 2018 before he could tell her his conviction had been overturned. His conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal on 23rd April 2021. Next, we move to a summary of the evidence of Mrs. Jacqueline MacDonald. Mrs. MacDonald was brought up in Preston, but lived in America for 21 years. Her husband is a US citizen who worked for the military and the Presidential Guard. She moved back to England with her family in 2005 and became Subpost mistress of the Broughton Post Office in 2006. She first experienced a shortfall in the Horizon system of €2,000 and was made to pay back that shortfall. This was after the installation of a second Horizon system at her branch. Mrs. MacDonald says she would sometimes telephone the system helpline up to 5 times a week, but ultimately found this was unhelpful. The usual response, she says, was, "It'll work itself out." By the end of September 2008, Horizon was showing an excess cash amount at her branch of £50,000. Mrs. MacDonald was suspended following an audit on the 1st of October 2008, and she says she was relieved when auditors arrived because she thought they would help. She says, but then the mood quickly changed. Following the audit, Mrs. MacDonald was asked to repay a total of £93,947.93. Investigators attended and searched their home. She says this was horrible. She attended an interview in October 2008. Her contract was terminated a month later, and she describes being devastated. Her husband and 3 children all worked in the shop, so lost their livelihoods when it closed. Mrs. MacDonald subsequently had to declare herself bankrupt, as did her husband. She was prosecuted for theft and false accounting. Whilst waiting for her case to go to the Crown Court, she experienced stress, anger, and problems sleeping. She was terrified at the prospect of going to prison. She says, "The post office just seemed focused on getting a conviction and did not even agree to a forensic accountant being constructed." Mrs. MacDonald attended the trial of another Subpost mistress who had pleaded not guilty, but who had been found guilty after trial and was sentenced to imprisonment. Mrs. MacDonald was deeply disturbed by that experience and so then pleaded guilty to theft and false accounting. She says the whole situation significantly impacted her mental health, and she did consider suicide at one stage. Mrs. MacDonald has now been diagnosed as having suffered with an adjustment disorder in the form of mixed anxiety and depression. Following conviction, the Post Office commenced proceeding of Crime Act proceedings. She says they took her car, and after a second hearing, it was agreed she could repay her debt to them for £1, as she was by then bankrupt. In January 2011, Mrs. MacDonald was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment, with the judge telling her that she had breached the community and the Post Office's trust. She was shocked and couldn't believe it. she describes being taken away from her family as the worst form of punishment. She says she never felt so lonely in her life. She tried to be brave, but was petrified. She spent parts of her imprisonment with violent offenders and says she witnessed fights. She was in prison for 4.5 months and spent another 4.5 months on curfew with a tag. When she and her family decided to go back to America, her application for a green card was initially refused because of her conviction. The US Embassy allowed her second application, but only on notice that she had to travel to America within a week. She wants the inquiry to know her first grandchild was born while she was in prison. Tragically, her daughter died in November 2011, and Mrs. MacDonald wants the inquiry to know that she was unable to spend her daughter's last birthday with her because she was in prison. Whilst her conviction was quashed in April 2021, she says, "I honestly don't know if my family will ever be the same again. I know I certainly won't be." Her relationship with her mum, her dad, and her sister has never been the same. On returning to England, and the prospect of doing so, Mrs. MacDonald states, "The thought of going back to England makes me feel sick, because every time I have to come back to the States, I've been taken into the interrogation room because my conviction is attached to my passport."
Miss Patrick, will you read 2 more, and then we'll give you a voice of rest?
So I'm very sure everybody will be by that time very full of hearing from me.
Oh, that's fine.
We next move to a summary of the evidence of Abiodun Omatoso. Before working for the post office, Abiodun Omatoso was a management consultant. He has an economics degree and began working as a sub-postmaster at the Walsworth Post Office at around August 2005. On 26 October 2006, the branch was audited and £50,000 was alleged to have been short. He had always paid smaller shortfalls when they were worth £40 or £50, but as they got larger, he could not afford to pay and so rolled it over. He was spending hours counting money, and at the end, the figure was still not right. Mr. Omatoso says, "During this time, my mood was very low, and I even contemplated taking my own life. I was ashamed and angry." He says investigators visited his house, but he refused to let them search his house. He says he was told that if he tried to get a solicitor, they would make things difficult for him. He says investigators even tried to speak to his neighbours to ask them questions about him. He says of this, "I felt degraded." He attended his interview with the post office without legal representation. He says he was informed that if he was to comply, then everything would be fine. He had no idea others were going through the same things as him. His contract was terminated and he was charged with theft. Mr. Omatoso says, "I was told that if I complied, I would get a slap on the wrist." However, he told them he was not pleading guilty for something he did not do. On 28 August 2008, he was found guilty of theft at Luton Crown Court. He was sentenced to 28 months in prison, which was a complete shock to him. He says, "It was heartbreaking to lose everything." At his sentencing, the judge accused him, he says, of trying to malign the integrity of professionals. He wants the inquiry to know his health has suffered massively in prison, where his eyesight deteriorated and his blood pressure shot up. He says he's been diagnosed since with adjustment disorder, mixed anxiety and depressed mood. He's been told that his glaucoma, hypertension, and diabetes may have been caused by prolonged acute stress. His wife left him when he was in prison, and they're now divorced. Following his conviction, he was prevented from seeing his children. This absolutely devastated him. He'd been a very hands-on father, doing school runs and accompanying both children on sporting activities. He says, "Not being able to do this broke my heart." He says that before his conviction, he used to go out of his way to help people in the community. But he says now the local community is wary of me. He says, "They think I am a thief." Mr. Omatoso says, "To think people thought these things about me brought me deep shame." Before his conviction, he'd been asked to consider becoming a school governor. This was no longer an option afterwards. He was subject to a confiscation order to pay back the entire shortfall of over £50,000. He was forced to sell the family home, his business, and to declare bankruptcy. He found it difficult to get another job following conviction, and he says he suffered terribly financially. He says now he feels vindicated, but he wants the inquiry to know. He says, "I will have to live with this harrowing experience forever." Chair, we move finally to the summary of the statement of Mr. Ian Warren. Ian Warren qualified as a chartered accountant in the early 1970s, and he'd worked as a financial controller, and he'd also worked in management. In 2004, after the death of his father, this presented an opportunity for him to reappraise his career. He and his partner bought a village shop with a post office branch in a village they both loved. He began work as a sub-postmaster of the St James's Street branch in Essex in October 2004. Shortly after taking over, he was trying to balance the account and could not get the figures to match. The figure was short by £1,800. He called the helpline, who wrote this off as human error, as he was new. It happened again several months later, with a figure of around £2,400. He had to repay this from his salary. The post office never explained why this happened. In 2007, an error appeared on horizon of a shortfall of £17,500. It disappeared the next morning. He contacted the helpline and they told him to keep an eye on it. He made various requests through the helpline and the area manager for more training, but says these fell on deaf ears. He said it was infuriating. In April 2008, he was audited. He said he was more than happy to allow them to conduct an audit. It was discovered there was a shortfall of £24,520.45, and it was later said he owed £18,412.50. Of the investigation, Mr. Warren says investigators arrived at the house and treated him like a criminal. He felt they'd already made their minds up. He agreed to them searching his house, but he said he felt so degraded. He was suspended on the same day, and the post office sought to prosecute him for theft and false accounting. His contract was terminated on 4th June 2008, but it took effect earlier, from April of that year. A restraining order was placed on his assets, and he paid back the shortfall with an inheritance. He pleaded guilty to theft after being informed if he did so, he may avoid a custodial sentence. He wants the inquiry to know he was particularly concerned he may receive a higher sentence because he was a qualified accountant. He felt like he was committing perjury when he pleaded guilty. When he pleaded guilty. He had to go on to notify the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and he was stripped of his membership. This conviction prevented him from reverting to that old career. He was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment, suspended for 18 months, and was subject to a community service order of 75 hours. He became depressed and has since taken various antidepressants. He had a previous diagnosis of alcohol abuse, which worsened with stress on being charged with an offence. He says, charged with an offence I knew I had not committed. There was a newspaper article about him published in 2009, and he had to sell papers in his shop which labelled him as a criminal. And he says this was so hurtful. He wants the inquiry to know he's particularly concerned that he is no longer able to practice as an accountant. He no longer has a problem with alcohol. After his conviction, he required therapy. After his conviction, he did what he could to advise local people and local organisations that he had been wronged. He told them he would be challenging the outcome. However, he says he found this very draining, both emotionally and physically. In 2014, he was diagnosed with bowel cancer, and after several months of chemotherapy and radiotherapy, this resulted in the need for a stoma and catheterisation. He thinks the stress of the post office scandal has contributed to his health outcomes. He wants the inquiry to know he remains in a state of disbelief at what happened and for the events for which he was not responsible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
So I think we'll have a shortish break, and then we'll hear the two next witnesses back to back, so to speak. Yeah? Thank you.
Chair, our next witness is Mrs. Pauline Stonehouse.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
My name's Ruth Kennedy, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you confirm your name, please?
Yes, Pauline Ann Stonehouse.
Have you got a copy of your witness statement
I
there?
have, yeah.
And I think it should be dated the 13th of January 2022.
Yeah,
And is that your signature on page 9, the last page of the statement?
it is, yeah.
Have you read the statement through recently?
I have,
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
yes.
I'm going to start by asking a couple of introductory questions about you. How old are you now?
49.
And how long have you been married?
This year will be 28 years.
How many children do you have?
2.
When did you start working for the post office?
I first started working for them, 93-ish. I think before me and Chris got married. When we first met, I think I was still with them. Worked for a franchise post office for Ryman Stationers. Started off in the Holborn branch, not far from the Chancery Law Courts, and then moved around a bit to various other branches, and ultimately ended up as branch manager of Lower Regent Street, a busy 6-counter office.
And what role did you start in initially?
Just started off as a counter assistant.
And why did you want to then become a sub-post mistress?
We moved from London up to Sunderland. I'd left the post office there because I felt I couldn't go any further, and took a job temporarily with the London Underground. That didn't work out well for me, as my health at the time wasn't too great with ladies' problems, and I got dismissed before my yearly contract was up for renewal. And because of those consequences, we could no longer keep our house in London. So we chose to relocate back to Sunderland, where my husband is from. And at that point, our daughter was 11 months old, and she was about 3, I suppose. I saw a job advertised for a small post office inside a small convenience store, took that on, got back into it, really enjoyed myself, moved there from there a short while later to another small post office, and then it was while I was there that we came up with the idea of starting a business of our own, and we toyed with a few ideas, and we decided to go down the post office retail route. We searched a few and then decided upon the one that we eventually purchased,
Which one was that?
and that was Seaburn Post Office in Sunderland.
I think you say in your statement that was around November 2004.
Yeah.
That'd be about right. How much did you pay for that?
I think we paid 80,000 for the business as a whole.
And can you just describe in a bit more detail that business?
It was a old-style post office counter, so behind glass at the back when we first purchased it, with a retail unit at the front that sold sweets, Candy Rock, usual typical seaside little store, off licence, that sort of thing. We did then put new tills in, we put a slush machine in, bought different things in, and it was a good little business.
How many staff did you have?
Me, Chris, and three others.
How did you feel about becoming a sub-post mistress and working for the post office at that time?
I was excited. It was a new challenge, more responsibility. I felt like I was ready for that. Yeah, excited. Definitely the word.
And what training did you receive on Horizon?
The previous post office I worked in had Horizon, and I think I was given basic training there. Not on the balancing side of things, that was somebody else's job to do that. But basic counter, and my own stock then at the end of the week, but not as an office balance. It wasn't until after we got our own that then it became more involved.
And when you took over your own, what training did you receive then?
Next to nothing. They just presumed I knew what I was doing. I think it was a short instructions, might have been a day, probably, if that, to show me how to balance, and I was just left to my own devices.
How did you find balancing on Horizon?
Initially, it was fine. I had no problems while it was still the old style counter. And then the post office requested, almost demanded, that we change the style of counter to a open shared usage out of hours counter. So you'd have the shop till as well as the post office till side by side. And you'd use that majority of the times of the day. There wasn't really any set hours. You still had a back small little counter where the safe was, but then you had a roller cash safe at the front. And once that was installed, then the balancing started going wrong from that point onwards.
How long was that after you took over your own, just roughly?
Youngest daughter was born 2006. So it was while that was being installed, it wasn't long after that I discovered I was pregnant after 5 hard years of trying for a second child. And it was while I was pregnant, so it would have been 2005, that the issues started happening, as in the bigger differences.
And what were those issues or bigger differences?
It would have been, whereas before you would have had shortages before. It would have been 5, 10. You expect small shortages, but when that got put in, it was 100, 200, 300. And it just kept on mounting up, and it was going out of the shop till, and you were fine at first, but it was coming to a Wednesday night, and I would still be there 10 o'clock in the evening, searching through everything, counting everything back. And never finding it.
How did that make you feel?
Frustrated, incompetent, like I didn't know what I was doing. Sought help and didn't get any satisfaction from them.
Did you make use of the helpline?
Yeah, jokingly, laughingly, yes. They weren't very helpful. It was always, oh, transaction correction will come back. And it never did. You're always reassured. I mean, working in previous post offices, it happened. You'd get shortages, and they would come back. It may take a couple of weeks, but they would come back. And none of mine ever did. None of them ever came back.
What did you do in order to get these shortfalls or discrepancies to go away?
Initially, it was putting money in from our own shop takings, and they would go in, and it was getting to the point where it was just too much money. There's no way you can run a business and be taking out of your till every week £200 or £300. You add that up over a month. It's a lot of money that's not going into my bank account. That's not buying more stock. That's not feeding my children.
I think you say in your statement you spoke to a post office business manager on around the 29th of May 2007. Is that right?
Yeah.
What did you say to that person?
I was at a meeting in the hotel just down the road. It was like a monthly. No, may not have been monthly. It was just a meeting that had been arranged for postmasters, and I'd basically told her that over the last period of time I had been showing the figures as being correct when they weren't, because I could no longer keep the money, put the money in, and I told her how stressed out I was over it, and she says, "You do know that I will have to suspend you." And I said, "I understand that." I said, "No, until I investigate." And then the following morning, I think it was the following morning, the auditors came in and basically threw me out.
And how did you feel at that time before the audit?
Worried, but I honestly thought they would find something to find the money, to find where it had gone. They're meant to be the experts. They're supposed to know what they're doing, and they would find where my problems arised, but they didn't. It just ended up showing more money than what I expected.
When you spoke to the post office business manager, what did you expect her to say?
I don't know, to be honest. I think reassurance that they could solve the problem. The fact that I'd sought out their help previously, the fact that they sent a trainer in and he confirmed that everything I was doing was correct and that I was an experienced postmistress and that I was doing nothing wrong. So if I was doing everything correctly, then how could I be having all of these shortages? And there was no explanation for that.
What was the alleged shortfall at that time? Do you remember, roughly?
I think initially, I thought it was about 14,000, but I think when the audit was done, it was over 15.
What were the auditors like?
I honestly can't remember. I think it was 2 men, but I honestly don't remember. I think I was in shock and denial. I think that they were there, and once they're there, they told me, they basically grabbed my keys off me, and that was it. I was no longer allowed access to the post office.
I think a week later in your statement you say you were then interviewed by the post office.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Who were you interviewed by?
It was a woman, that's all I can tell you. I don't remember her name. It was just a woman as part of the post office investigation team. I think husband for me, it was in Gateshead, I think. Not that I remembered that. I could have sworn it was somewhere else, but you know, I could be anywhere. And I was there for hours and hours and hours, and she kept repeating the same questions all the time.
What were those questions?
Always, what had you done with the money? Are you sure you haven't stolen it? And I says, well, if I'd stolen the money, then why would I have been seeking your help? Why would I have been asking all the questions at the helpline? Why would I be pleading? If I was stealing the money, I'd be trying to hide my misdoings, not confessing to them. So yes, I'd false accounted, but there's no way I would have stolen it. And then she went on from there then to try and accuse my husband of taking it instead. And and lying to me and taking. She said the shop couldn't have been doing well, and how do I know he wasn't taking the money to inflate the shop till? I said, well, he wouldn't do that, but she kept on going on about that as well.
What representation or support did you have at that interview?
I think I took a member of the Federation with me. I think, but I honestly can't remember his name either. I think I had somebody with me, definitely. It wasn't a solicitor or anything like that.
How did you feel after that interview? Shocked
More than anything, but the way I'd been treated. I felt like they made me feel like I was some master criminal. And to quote the words that she said, I have to prosecute you to set an example so others won't do it because you are essentially the first. Which obviously we now know that was a complete pack of lies.
What were you charged with at that interview?
I was charged with false accounting. It went on to be 6 counts of false accounting.
And what did you plead?
I pled guilty.
Why did you plead guilty?
I felt like I had no choice. I think I was fearful of going to prison. I was made to feel like it was the only option. My eldest daughter was only, at the time, 8, coming up to 9. Youngest daughter was only 2. I wasn't going to leave them. I couldn't have coped without my girls.
What were you sentenced to?
A 6 months suspended sentence.
And how did that feel?
Awful, because they made me feel, like I said before, like I was some horrible master criminal, and I'd done nothing wrong apart from probably being slightly naive. Not understanding the full consequences of my actions, but I felt like I had no other choice.
Your conviction was recently overturned, is that right? I'm going to now ask you some questions about the impact that all of this has had on you. What happened to you financially as a result of all of this?
We had to declare ourselves bankrupt, so we lost our business. We could no longer pay the mortgage, so we lost our home too. Luckily, the mortgage company went after us to get us out of the house, but we had to go to court, and the judge luckily wouldn't grant them permission to throw us out. He gave us time to find somewhere else, with the children being still small.
And when you say we, do I take it both your husband and you declared bankrupt?
Yeah, we both went bankrupt. Yeah, we had it was a joint business, so we're both as much impacted.
Who did you ask for financial help?
We're lucky that we both got good parents. My parents were able to help out with bits and bobs. I think once we did get rehomed, my father paid for flooring. We had no flooring on. We had no carpet on the floor for a good 3-4 months. I'm asthmatic. I got eczema. I can't cope with all that dust. My father said, he used to call me Chick. Come on, Chick, he says, I'll buy you the floor. And I'm like, no, Dad, you can't do that. He says, no, I'm not having you ill either. He says, I'll buy you the flooring. And he paid for the flooring for us. It was little things like that. And without them, I don't know how we would have coped. Even buying us groceries, and we didn't know what else to do.
I think you mentioned in your statement your husband got another job.
Yeah.
What was that?
He trained to be a bus driver for Go North East. Within 2 weeks, I think it was, of the bankruptcy, he managed to find a job.
You mentioned in your statement that your story was covered in the local paper, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a bit about that?
They caught me leaving the court at Newcastle Crown Court. They never spoke to me. They tried to speak to me, but I refused to speak. But they caught my picture, took my picture, and put it on the front page of the Sunderland Echo. Local postmistress charged and found guilty of false accounting, and gave numerous details about myself and my family, and it was horrible.
How did it feel to see yourself on the front page of a newspaper?
Awful, because people read a story and they judge you accordingly, and no one knew the story. My friends did and my family did, yes, but not anybody else who would have known me through coming into the shop, ex-customers and so on, will look at that and be judge, jury and executioner, wouldn't they? And they'll basically just presume that what reported in that paper is correct.
And did you feel an impact on your reputation in the community because of that?
Not really. Nothing was ever said to my face. I think I shied away from going out as much. It was taking the girls to school and back home again, or being with my parents, but I never went down the seafront to where the shop was for ages. Chris never went down there for a good 6-7 years. He refused to even walk past the shop. It was too hurtful for us.
And what was the impact of all of this on your husband?
It's hard to say. He's a quiet man. He speaks when he has to. But yeah, it hurt him as well. It knocked his confidence just as much as mine. I think the fact that we've got each other was enough to get us through, but it hurt us both so much.
Did it impact on your marriage as well?
No, luckily we have a really strong marriage. I think the accusations that the investigators threw at him was enough to make me question him myself. And I mulled over it for a couple of days, and eventually I asked the question, did you steal the money? And I knew he didn't, but they put so much doubt into my mind, because I knew I hadn't took it. And if I hadn't took it, then who did? And if it wasn't a computer thing and it was theft, then who else do you blame apart from, a member of staff? And that could have ended my marriage. But luckily we're strong, and said this year's 28 years marriage, we've been together 30, and I don't know what I'd do without him.
What about the impact on your children? Did you feel it had an impact on them or your relationship with them?
The youngest one, no, she was too young to know what was going on. It's only in the last, I suppose, since November when the conviction was overturned, that she's old enough now at 15 to understand and ask questions, and ask questions she did. God, did she ask questions. And I think she was very understanding, and I was more worried about with it being raised in the paper again and me being on the local news, that it would have some impact on her in case anybody said anything to her, and it didn't, thankfully. As for the oldest one, so in 2008, she would have been coming up to 9. We had to move her school, so she lost her friends, and that had a big impact. I don't remember being an anxious child before that. She was quite confident. After that, I think it did knock her, having to move and lose everything, really. Lose her home and lose her friends, and have to restart in a new school and be bullied and picked on because she was the new girl. And I don't think she ever recovered from that, I don't think, to be honest.
What would you like from the post office now?
I would like somebody to hold their hands up and say, oh, I'm sorry. Someone's had to have made whoever that first person was that made that decision has ruined so many lives. And that person has had a knock-on effect to everybody else's decisions after that. And someone's got to be held accountable for that. Someone has to be. I mean, apology is never going to be enough. Compensation is never going to be enough because none of us are ever going to get over this, ever. But somebody has to be held accountable.
Is there anything else you'd like to say to the chair?
No, I had written something on my phone on the way down here in the car, and I had to cry reading it to my husband on the way down, reading it out. It's fine typing something, but as soon as you read it out, you get overly emotional. But no, I think we've covered most of that in talking to you here. But what I would like to say is, I used to be such a really confident woman, and I never expected my life to take the turn it did. And since all this has happened, I've lost both my parents, my father through cancer, my mother through a heart attack. So they never saw me have my name cleared. And then since then, gone on to be diagnosed with breast cancer. It's been 3 years. And I'm alive to tell the tale. And that was like life-altering in itself. But what the post office did, no, I'll never forget that. I'll never forget what they did to me and my family and the rest of us as well. So yeah, I hope that all of us, postmasters and branch managers, whoever else has been affected by this, get the compensation and the rightful acknowledgement that we're all innocent and that we need something done and be held accountable for it. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you, Sir Wynne.
Well, thank you for coming. It's very difficult to sit there and do what you've done, so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for introducing me to your husband.
He's my rock.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Our next witness is Miss Marion Holmes.
All right. Take your time. There's no rush.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mrs. Holmes, before Ms. Kennedy asks you questions, I can see you've got a photograph and I can suspect who it is. So will you show us, please? Thank you.
My name's Ruth Kennedy and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you confirm your full name, please?
Marion Holmes.
And have you got, I think you've got 2 witness statements. Have you got a copy of both of those there?
Yeah.
Looking first at the first statement, I think it should be dated the 8th of February 2022.
That's right.
And if you turn to the last page, which I think is page 11, is that your signature?
That's my signature.
Have you read through this statement recently?
Yes.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge?
Yes, the only slight difference is at one point it says his conviction was on the front page of the paper and it wasn't, it was further inside. But other than that, I think it's right.
Thank you. And turning then to your second statement, it's dated the 8th of March 2022.
Yeah.
And it runs to 2 pages.
Yeah,
Is that your signature there?
that is.
And have you read through this recently?
Yes.
Is it true to the best of your knowledge
Yes.
and belief? Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of introductory questions about you. How old are you now?
Still 79.
And you talk in your statement about your late husband. What was his name?
Peter Anthony Holmes.
And how long were you married before he died?
Nearly 52 years.
How many children do you have?
3.
What jobs did Peter have before he became a sub-postmaster and went on to work for the post office?
He was a policeman for 12 years and then we went into his parents' hotel when they retired, and we were there for nearly 20 years. And then he went in to be a sub-postmaster for, I can't remember when he came out of being a sub-postmaster, when we sold it, but then he went as relief postmaster when people went on holiday or when the post office wanted somebody to run an office. And then he was offered in 1996, he was offered a job as manager of the Jesmond Post Office.
And where was the hotel that he ran for many years?
It was in Jesmond where he'd grown up. I mean, we say a hotel, it started off as a family house that they took paying guests in, and it increased as most of the hotels do.
Why did he want to work for the post office?
When we came out of the hotel, I mean, he'd been self-employed for best part of his working life. So he wanted to be self-employed, but he also wanted to make sure that there was a steady income. And in the hotel, we had always, I mean, we say we ran it, but basically people came and stayed with us. So we were involved with the people. And he wanted to continue with that. And in a post office, you're very much involved with the people. And so I think that was probably the biggest motivation for taking post office as opposed to anything else.
When Horizon was introduced, he was already working in Jesmond, is that
Yes.
right? Do you know what training he received at that time?
According to his letter, he had 2 days, which he wrote and said was not adequate, and nobody really knew what they were talking about.
You've mentioned a letter. Could you just explain a bit about
Yes, I came across a letter that Peter wrote in 1999 where he points out that the training that he got wasn't accurate, wasn't any good. There's 2 different kinds of post office. There's the sub-post offices, but then there's the Crown offices. And a lot of the work that was done was on what a sub-postmaster would never come across, but Crown offices would, but they lumped it all together. So obviously the training was biased towards the Crown offices. And I think he states that it didn't touch on how to balance, which is a major part of the post office. And really, when he asked questions, nobody knew what the answers were. He felt as if the trainers were training as they went along.
Do you remember him talking about how he found using Horizon at the time?
Not really, because I'd just set up my own business for the first time in our lives. You know, we were running separate businesses. So, yes, he would. I remember him coming home. I think it was the second day. I think it was he was home earlier than we'd expected. And he says, you know, it's not that none of them know what they're doing. It had been a waste. And this must have been when the Horizon system was actually on trial, because I think it didn't actually go into live stream until into the 2000s. Yeah, I get mixed up. Yes.
Did he ever talk to you about noticing shortfalls or discrepancies?
No.
Do you know what he would do? Did he ever tell you about what he would do later when he noticed shortfalls or discrepancies?
Yeah, it's hard to remember what he told me at the time and what I found out after we got into the process of, you know, after he'd been sacked. But I did know that when he had his own post office, they had a system, and I went with him to we did a day's interview, I think, and I went before he got a post office, and I went with him. And the one thing I can remember them saying was, any shortfalls you're responsible for. So Peter had a separate account which he kept, and if the weekend balance said £50 down, then he put it in out of that account, because he knew that maybe in 2 weeks' time that would come back. and evidently he was waiting for error notices to come back. But I didn't know this until afterwards.
You mentioned in your statement that Peter's post office was subjected to an audit, I think in 2008. Do you remember what they found?
Yeah, they found that there was 46,000 so many hundred and so many pence short. Again, you know, I knew nothing of it until he came to the shop and called me out, and he said I've just been kicked out of the post office. And that was, yeah,
How did that make you feel?
dazed. You know, and my assistant said, look, Marion, get yourself home. You needed more at home than you are here. So she took over the shop, cancelled the class that I was supposed to be taking that night. But we always thought that, well, he was innocent. So, you know, I don't think we really believed. And I remember the next day I came back from, I used to keep a lot of spare equipment in the garage, and I came back and the door was unlocked. I said, oh, where's your car? Oh, he said, they brought me home. I said, who? And he said, oh, they're upstairs. And three of the post office people had come brought him home and were going through everything in his office. And Peter, being Peter, had said, anybody fancy a brew? Which was his first words, whether it was a workman or anything, you know, anybody fancy a brew? No. And he said, I'm going to have one. So one of them came down and watched him in case he went and found some money and hid it. And I think that was when, and he was on the stairs, and I just said, they don't seriously think you took that money. You know, and he said, yeah, they do. Yeah, they did.
And how did it feel to have people like that in your home?
Awful. You know, you just can't comprehend it, because again, you know, I mean, the last person who would ever take anything was Peter. You know, it wasn't. I remember, we were in Lincoln once, and we'd all gone out for a carvery, and there was a mix-up in the bill. When we got back, Peter realised that they'd missed one of the meals off. He drove 20 minutes back to that pub and paid them. You know, that's somebody who would take money from his own post office, but they believed him.
What did they accuse him of doing? What crime?
To start with, it was theft of 46,000, and it wasn't, you know, have you taken it? It was, what have you done with it? Nobody said, have you taken it? They said, what have you done with it? There was he worked for, you know, the father and two sons, and there were the three of them and the three post office evidently in the room. Fortunately, I've heard a lot of them were taken to the police station. Peter wasn't. He was taken to the Khan's house, and all they kept saying was, well, have you bought this? Have you bought that? What have you done with it? Where's the money? It must have been awful, you know.
What was he convicted of? I think you say in the beginning of 2010.
Yes, I think it was December 2009, 2009, come on. We had two appearances at the Crown Court, and at the first one we were called into the barrister's office before, and he said, oh, the post office have said if you admit false accounting, we'll drop the theft charge. Well, as an ex-policeman, a 67-year-old with diabetes, he did not want to go to prison. I mean, he knew what ex-policemen's lives were like if they ever went into prison. And naively, unfortunately, we didn't think if he pleaded guilty to false accounting. Plus, as he said, he knew he had, because the advice was always, well, if you balance up, it'll write itself. So you write in a false number. That's the way the system was taught. So that's what he did. And so he knew, basically, yes, once you've done that, you've false accounted. But One of the problems was that balances were always on a Wednesday, and pension day and benefits day was on a Thursday. Well, if you didn't balance, you couldn't open the post office. So you had to balance. So the advice was balance it and it'll sort itself out. And it didn't.
What sentence did he receive?
3 months curfew. He was supposed to be tagged, but as one of our friends who was in had been a probation officer, he spoke to the defence barrister, the prosecuting barrister, sorry, and he'd said, it's the first time I've been in court when the prosecuting barrister, the judge and the defence barrister were all on the same side. The judge he basically said, I've got to give you a sentence. And he didn't want to give him community service, so that he tagged him for 3 months. Curfew for from 7 o'clock at night till 7 the next morning. But they never did put a tag on him. They just trusted him to do, and they did.
What was that curfew like? How did you find it?
It was difficult. I mean, one of the first problems was that the first meeting we went to for the JFSA was in Bedford, and so Peter said to Alan Bates, if I come down, can I see somebody straight away, because I can just about get from Newcastle to Bedford, see somebody and get back within the 12 hours that I'm allowed, and things like that. Friday night we used to go and deliver, I did wedding cakes, was part of my business, so we would deliver them on Friday night and then stop for a meal and spend the profit on the way back. We couldn't do that. There was lots of little my youngest daughter was visiting universities, but if Peter took her, he had to make sure that he could get back for 7 o'clock. Yeah, little things, compared with what a lot of them did. We were lucky, but it was things that just sort of impact on your life that you don't realise until you've lost your freedom what it's like to be able to come and go as you want.
How was Peter after his conviction?
When you live with somebody as long as that, I mean, nothing happened overnight, and really, it was only when you're looking back. I would think a simple way of saying it was he shut down. I took on extra work so that we could keep our heads above the water. So really, we didn't see much of each other. I mean, 3 days a week I was going out at 8 in the morning and coming back at 10 o'clock at night. And really, he had nothing to do but sit around. So, yeah, it was only when he died, and most of the letters that I got said, the thing I'll miss is his sense of humour. And I said to my daughter, I said, the sad thing is I'd forgotten he'd got one. And that really sums up what happened to him. Yeah.
You've mentioned your cake shop business, which you owned at the time that Peter was being investigated. And I think you mentioned in your statement that you paid money into a joint account. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a perfect storm. The way my business worked, I banked, I think it was Santander, and I could pay as many cheques, and it was before the days of cards. We know that very few people use cards. And I could pay as many cheques in as I wanted free of charge. But cash, I could only pay a certain amount in, and then I got charged. So we put the cash into the joint account. Our accountant just took the whole lot and sorted it out at the end. And it was just unfortunate that almost an exact amount that went in that year was the amount that went missing from the post office. And of course, Peter was one that he was always early for anywhere. So when he was at work, he was there by the time the post office was in the back of a Medicentre. So he was there as when Sunil came to open up. And he was in and he got everything sorted out, including paying my money into the bank. because of Barclays Bank with the post office. So he could do it there and then, all paid in, everything out, right, I'm ready for starting. And afterwards they said that that was why he'd gone in early, was to pinch money. Looked at from the outside, yeah, you can see where they were coming from, but it was just the way he worked. It was just what he was like. You know, he knew that when he did a lot of foreign currency, so he knew that once there was a travel agent in the street, so he knew once that door opened, it was heads down, and often he didn't look up until the door closed. So, you know, he was ready for it, but no, that was why he went in early, was to pinch money.
You mentioned in your statement that his conviction was overturned after he died, is that right? How does it feel to know that he won't get to see that?
Bittersweet. I never thought I would become a campaigner, but once he died, I thought, there's nothing I'm going to stop until everybody gets what they want, what they deserve. And yeah, my son took me down. I shall be forever grateful that he took me down to London, because I don't think I would have gone on my own. But it was lovely just to hear somebody say he's innocent. But just, I wish he'll know one day.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the impact that all of this has had on you. In your statement, you mentioned the loss of his salary. Is there anything else you wanted to mention in terms of the financial impact that you've suffered?
No, I mean, as I say, the one thing I could do extra was teaching, and it was the one profitable bit of my business. So we were lucky because, we were on the end of our mortgage, and it was an interest-only mortgage, so it actually matured just after Peter died. So I was then able to sell the house, buy a small bungalow, take equity out, and that's what I'm living on now. I couldn't have done it in the house, but I was able to do it by selling down. And other than that, it's really, well, you just think about everything you spend. You know, can I afford this? Can I afford that? It's something that is permanently on your mind. But as I say, we didn't go under. We didn't lose our house. We were lucky. A lot of them weren't.
You mentioned in your statement that Peter's story was covered in the local press. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
I think that was the bit that hurt him most, because a friend rang us up the following day and said, I mean, one of our friends who'd had a son who was killed in a car accident, and she said, beware of doorstep press. And Pete said, right, well, the doorbell went, Helen answered it, and she said, oh, Dad, it's for you. You know, you think you're ready and you're not. And this person was obviously press and said, you know, could he speak to him? And he said no. And our next door neighbour said, do you realise when that person was at your door, there was somebody across the road taking a photograph? So the next morning, friend said, have you seen the Journal this morning? And there's a big, awful photograph of Peter with a full page, ex-policeman guilty of false accounting, and a full page about it. And I think that was the bit that really hurt him. And he always said, really, all he wanted was his name cleared and an article in the paper the size of the one that was when he was convicted. And bless them, Sam Steen and crew. I just throw away remark, but they arranged for the paper to come down, and his name has been cleared in the local paper, which was what he wanted.
What impact did that have on his reputation in the community?
The people who knew us, and a lot of people who he hadn't seen and had forgotten about, you know, ex-colleagues from the police force, got in touch and said, this is wrong, there's no way you've stolen any money. I mean, they all knew he was the last person to ever steal money. how many people thought that there was no smoke without fire, I don't know. They're the ones you never know. But certainly the people that we knew, nobody even began to believe that he was guilty.
You mentioned in your statement that he wanted to volunteer for Daft as a Brush, a charity. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a charity that somebody set up, and they go around and pick anybody up that's going for chemotherapy to the local hospital. And they have these blue vans with yellow brushes all over. I mean, Daft as a Brush, where the name came from, but it's lovely. And they're run by volunteer drivers with a volunteer helper. And they'll take somebody to chemo and sit with them if they want, and then bring them home. And he said, you know, the one thing he loved was driving, and it was the one job he could have done, was driving for that. And he said, I can't, because I'll have to do a CRB check, and they'll find out I've got a conviction. So he never even did that.
Do you know how that made him feel?
Yeah, I felt helpless and hopeless, you know, and worthless, I suppose, because the only thing that kept him going, really, was the JFSA, because it was something he would get involved in. Other than that, he had nothing. I mean, his love was driving. Well, he can't drive without money. He had to sell his beloved Subaru, his Scooby, and, you know, that was it, yeah.
What was the impact of all of this on his health?
Well, it didn't do it any good. I mean, he died of a brain tumour, and there's a lot of experiments, a lot of statements done, a lot of work done saying that stress is a big part of cancer. It's easy. How long's a piece of string? We don't know why he got cancer of the brain, but it certainly didn't help him. And yeah, we used to tease him that he hasn't got 2 legs, he's got 4 wheels. But I think because we couldn't go out, he hadn't anything to do, so he did just sit around. And yeah, it didn't do his health any good whatsoever. I mean, he'd been diabetic since he was 27, yeah. But he'd lived with that and lived with it well. But, you know, you get to into your 70s and you think, well, is it just old age creeping on, or is there something wrong? Yeah, it's difficult to quantify, really.
What about the impact on your health?
Again, I had to have a mastectomy 8 years ago. Again, some studies say the stress causes that, but I'm a Yorkshire girl, and a Yorkshire farmer's daughter, and I suppose our ethos is, well, you just keep going. And yeah, I've come through it. Just.
Was there an impact on your marriage?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking the other day, and really, you know, you start off married life, and then the children come along, and then when they've gone, you join together. We never got that last bit. We just chugged along together, and yeah, I didn't retire until 2012, and he died in 2015. And in that time, well, basically we had no money to do anything anyway. You know, you've lost a lot of life that you don't realise at the time until you look back and see what you have done along. Yeah.
Did it have an impact on your children?
They had to go to work. The 2 older ones were at work. They'd both left home, but they had to go to work the next day, knowing that the father's picture. And Pete was always. It wasn't as if they didn't know who was. I mean, Fiona was married, so she didn't have the name Holmes, but people knew that he was her dad because he was always involved in their life. Helen, the younger one, she was actually sitting an A-level exam the day he was convicted, or an AS level or something, and she was hoping to go on to go to university or as a mature student, and she said she wasn't going because we couldn't. She was going to get a job to help support us, and we had a big job persuading her to go. But she went to Huddersfield, but bless her, every Friday night she drove home and she worked as a dog groomer on a Saturday and a kennel maid on a Sunday, and then drove back so that she could support herself because we weren't able to. And she nearly didn't. She's now a successful pharmacist, but she very nearly wasn't.
What would you like from the post office now?
Fairness. You know, I want them to acknowledge what they've done. They're still fighting it. They're not now, you know, accepting that what they did was so wrong. And I think that's mostly what I want.
Is there anything else you'd like to say to the chair?
I'm on my soapbox now. I mean, one of the things I would like is everybody, whether it's Post Office, Fujitsu or the government, that either had a hand in this or knew about it, to be made to sit in a room and see all these witness statements. They're harrowing. And maybe at the end of that, they'll realise that we weren't just sub-postmasters. We were people whose lives they actually devastated. And there's nothing they can really bring that back. They say they're sorry. Words are cheap. We couldn't stand up in court and say, oh, I'm ever so sorry, and then walk out and carry on as if nothing had happened. You know, we had consequences to pay, and so should anybody who was involved in this. You know, it was awful. And the other thing they say was everybody's getting compensation. They're not. They're still fighting compensation. You know, they've hired a top law firm, and if Mr. Loophole isn't one of them, he's a very close cousin, because they are looking into every single thing, every single case. They're doing basically what the Post Office are very good at, spending money, other people's money, to try and dig themselves out of a hole. I think I heard one lady say that she'd been turned down because it wasn't the Horizon system. I was turned down because I hadn't got the right probate. The GFSA are turned down. They're frightened that the backers will want more money. They're just finding loopholes. I mean, it's. I think David said it was 1st of September 2021 that they put my application for compensation in. It's now March, and they keep saying, oh yes, I can get it. Bless David, they only said that I could have compensation because he said I was coming here today and I would be talking about it, and that suddenly, oh, I'm getting compensation. But that was 2 weeks, nearly 3 weeks ago, and still, you know, they're just fighting it, and they shouldn't be, you know. And we shouldn't have to apply for compensation. You know, the problem at the beginning was we had no money to fight them. It was this great big wall, and we'd got no money to fight them. So they just thought that they could walk all over us. I remember James Hartley saying when we were going for joint litigation, and he said the advantage of it being a public company, although they deny it's a public company, is that we can get backers because they can't go bust. The disadvantage is they've got a bottomless pit to pay with, and we haven't. And they knew that, and they priced us out of court then. And, you know, I've been lucky. I don't know whether everybody has, but David and his colleagues from Howe & Co are doing this, what is it called, pro bono? But we shouldn't, because we couldn't even apply for compensation if we didn't have any money. We shouldn't have to do that. You know, that the Post Office should they blithely say, oh yes, everybody's getting compensation, but they're not. And I think, you know, everybody should immediately get a temporary, you know, I've forgotten the word, what's compensation is it we're getting before they send it out, before they decide?
Do you mean interim compensation?
Interim, thank you very much. I've lost my words.
Don't worry. It's the
Interim
first time this morning.
compensation, yeah. Because we're all getting old. I mean, I was in my 60s and working when this started. I'm 80 next month and a widow. And there's more people like them. And really, you know, it's as David said, we have to be like Oliver Twist, keep asking for this and asking for that. We've proved that we were right and they were wrong, and we shouldn't have to keep fighting for them. You know, compensation won't take away what's happened, but at least it'll help us pay our bills. You know, there's energy bills and everything, and I just look at that. I saw a bit of a clip of a thing that Peter made, a programme that Peter made, and it started off with one of the early GFSA meetings, and I just thought, you know, I've just seen most of those people. Those people have aged more than 10 years in the last 10 years. They all look so young compared with what they do now. And it's because we've spent our time battling, and we're all tired of it. You know, yes. The other thing I want to know is why they did it. You know, was it because they wanted to make more profit? I mean, we used to drive down to Warwickshire, and you've got 4 hours in the car coming home. We used to, you know, go over what we talked about. And there was one week I said, you know, I think it's a bit of a conspiracy, because it was a time when they were trying to close post offices down, and there was protest from everybody. But there was, I think at that particular meeting, there were 2, if not 3 people who said that they'd actually found a buyer for their post office, but they were turned down by the post office as being suitable. One even had his own post office already, but he was classed as unsuitable. Now, it's easy to say, oh, well, you've lost your village post office. It's not our fault. The postmaster was pinching money, and we can't get anybody else to run it. You know, or was it because they wanted to show profit, and therefore it was help their bonuses? I don't know, but I want to know why they did it, because they knew, and Peter's letter proves that they knew. So why did they keep on doing it? Why did they not stop? And I hope I haven't left anything out, but I think, apart from saying, I mean, there's a lot of people helped me on my way. They all know who they are, and I thank them greatly. David's here, and David and Co are here today, and without them I wouldn't be here. But also I would like to say thank you to Wynne, because I feel that you're not just listening to us, you're hearing us, and that makes a big difference.
I'm supposed to say thank you to you. It's the other way around. So thank you for coming. Thank you for explaining your own experiences. But perhaps most of all, thank you for being such an effective advocate on behalf of your late husband. Right. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Then I'm going to invite Miss Patrick to read a few more statements. She's got her hands up. And then at around 1:45, we'll have lunch, and then we'll have our final witness at about 1:30, if that's all right with everyone. Thank you very much. So by the machine in front of me, well, let's go by the clock. It's nearly 12:30, and by the machine. So we'll stop again at 12:45. Don't rush it. Just do as many as you can in that period, okay?
Thank you, Chair. And I'll continue reading the summaries of the evidence of statements by core participants who are represented by Hudjo's solicitors. I'll begin with a summary of the evidence of Mr. Malcolm Watkins. Mr. Watkins was appointed as sub-postmaster of the Great Gransden branch in St Neots in December 2000. He first experienced small shortfalls, such as £60 or £65, and he would pay the shortfalls from his own pocket. He accepted that there was always going to be some element of shortfalls. An audit occurred on 12th September 2003, and he was advised that £65,000 was missing. He tried to tell the auditor that there must be something wrong with the system. A couple of weeks later, he was told there'd been a mistake, and the shortfall was actually £50,000. After the shortfall was alleged, his area manager arrived. He suspended Mr. Watkins and took all the money and anything of value. He was charged with theft. He pleaded guilty, his contract was terminated, and he paid the value of the shortfall shortly afterwards. He was sentenced to an 18-month prison sentence, suspended for 18 months. Mr. Watkins was told by a solicitor that to stay out of prison, he had to bite the bullet and pay the money back and put the shortages down to his lack of experience. He then instructed a different solicitor, and they told him the same thing. He was also told this by the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. To repay the shortfall, Mr. Watkins had to remortgage his home. His payments went up. He suffered anxiety and depression. When he was prosecuted, he felt alone because no one believed him and everyone assumed he was guilty. He told his wife that he had thought about killing himself. There were occasions on when he wanted to end it and says he was in a horrendously dark place. As a result of the events with the post office, he suffered anxiety and depression and took antidepressants. He cried and struggled to sleep. After his conviction was publicised in the press, his family experienced abuse. He says he went from being totally mortgage-free to being on a debt management plan. The situation led to his divorce. He wants the inquiry to know he went from being respected in the community to being a social outcast. On 19th July 2021, his conviction was overturned. He says, "I was put through hell and I did nothing, absolutely nothing wrong." He feels the post office employees were blinkered, and he wants to say to the inquiry, they thought because he earned money and drove a nice car, it must come from the money I had taken. It never occurred to them that I worked 7 days a week and started at 5 a.m. in the morning. He says to the inquiry, he cannot put a price on his life being destroyed. Next, we turn to a summary of the evidence of Mr. Tahir Mahmood. Mr. Mahmood is married and a father of 4. He was appointed sub-postmaster at the 10-acre branch in Selly Oak in May 1999. He liked the idea of serving the community. After Horizon was installed in 2000, he received about 2 weeks very basic training. During that training, a shortfall of around £4,000 to £6,000 was showing on Horizon. The trainer told him to put it in a suspense account, and this would eventually correct itself. Mr. Mahmood says of the helpline, it was very unhelpful. They indicated to him that the system was not at fault and that the shortfall would eventually resolve itself. He was eventually forced to pay the shortfall in full. He tells the inquiry that he experienced 2 robberies at the branch, which saw him and his sister both held at gunpoint. Throughout 2003 and 2004, shortfalls continued to occur, but the levels were increasing. He continued to put his own cash in to pay shortfalls. But by January 2005, Horizon was showing a shortfall of approximately £25,000. He says, "I knew I needed help," and he asked his father to help pay. This really hurt Mr. Mahmood because he did not want to tell his family and he did not want to let them down. On 30th of April, he was audited. The shortfall was around £33,000 and the post office investigators interviewed him. He recalls an investigator saying things like, "You're a criminal. This was a criminal act, and you took that money." He says of that day, "I was so ashamed when I went home. I broke down and told my family about what happened. I felt like I had let them down. I also felt like I'd let my community down. It was one of the worst days of my life." He was interviewed again on the 3rd of May 2005 with a representative from the National Federation of Subpost Masters, who was not very helpful. Investigators suggested he was the only person to have experienced problems with Horizon. When the post office demanded payment of the shortfall, he didn't have the money to pay. On 18th July 2005, he pleaded not guilty to false accounting. On transfer to Birmingham Crown Court and on legal advice, he pleaded guilty in order to avoid a custodial sentence. At the time, he had 2 young children and his wife was pregnant. Mr. Mahmood was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment and spent time at Winson Green and Sudbury prisons. He did not expect a custodial sentence and had attended court without his diabetes medication. Of Winson Green prison, he says, "You were kept in your cell for most of the day and only allowed out to shower in the morning, to eat, and for very short exercise breaks." He refused his wife and children requests to visit him as he was ashamed. His 3rd child was born while he was in prison, and he wants the inquiry to know this left him absolutely devastated. He was released in February 2006 and wore a tag for another 6 months. Once prospective employers find out about his conviction, they no longer wish to employ him. The family home was sold because he could no longer afford to pay the mortgage. He sold the post office branch at a loss of around £35,000. He and his family were homeless and had to rely on homeless hostels for around 8 months. His parents returned to Pakistan and his brother and sister moved away because he could no longer afford to support them. Mr. Mahmood is currently unemployed and reliant on benefits. He wants the inquiry to know about the impact within his wider family. At family gatherings, he would hear people gossiping about him and staring at him. He found this difficult, as he thought some of them may have believed he did take the money. He had not previously told his children about his conviction and only told them following its quashing by the Court of Appeal. Mr. Mahmood says, "Nothing can undo what I have been subjected to and the impact that this has had upon myself and my family." Next, we turn to the summary of the evidence of Mr. John Armstrong. In 1996, Mr. Armstrong bought Weston Post Office and became sub-postmaster there. He then later purchased Woolston Post Office in February 2003. He'd been encouraged to buy Woolston by the Post Office, which he felt demonstrated that the management had confidence in his ability to increase its business successfully. For a short period, he was running both post offices. When shortfalls started appearing, the help desk told him how to adjust the shortfall and told him it would work itself out the next day. It never did. This had also happened previously at the Western branch. At that time, he would pay a shortfall of approximately £3,000. By the time the auditors visited his second branch, the shortfalls had risen to almost £10,000. 2 auditors visited the Woolston branch on 28th June 2004, very early in the morning at 8:10. He told them they would find a £10,000 shortfall. He was suspended on 28th June 2005. He was told he would have to pay the shortfall after the audit. This left him with no option but to sell the post office, as he had no funds elsewhere. He repaid the entire shortfall of around £10,000 and also £2,000 in costs. On 30th of June 2005, he was interviewed and accused of misusing his finances by having large boats and cars, of which he says this was all incorrect and quite upsetting. He was charged with theft and, on advice from his barrister, reluctantly agreed to plead guilty in order to secure a lesser sentence. He could not risk going to prison. He was sentenced at Southampton Crown Court on 19th of May 2006, given 200 hours of community service and paid costs in the region of £2,000. His conviction was overturned on 19th July 2021. Of the impact upon him, Mr. Armstrong says he's been recently seen by a psychologist who recommended psychological support. He says that after his conviction, he became an introvert. He wouldn't speak to anyone. He wouldn't trust anyone. It was very lonely, and he became, as he puts it, completely the opposite to the extrovert I used to be. He said he'd never had a problem speaking in public before, and during a previous marriage he'd even been a district and a parish councillor. He said he would also swim, training youngsters at a local swimming club. He wants the inquiry to know that he still now finds it difficult to have conversations with strangers. He says, "Thankfully, my wife stood by me." It devastates him to think about the effect this has had on his wife. He said she became depressed and that their lives are very different now. He describes being exonerated as wonderful, but he wants an explanation. He wants to tell the inquiry he can't remember what it feels like to be normal, although he tries. He does not think anything will erase the stress of the past few years.
I think we're quite close to 12:45. So you've got 4 summaries left, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Were you intending to be here this afternoon? And I'm not asking you to be, just...
No, sir, I'm very much intending to stay till the end of the day.
Right, well, if you're doing that and you don't mind doing it, what I suggest is we start again at 1:30 with the witness, and depending how long that witness takes, there may be time for you to finish. But as it happens, I do have to finish earlier than normal today, so there's an outside chance that you'd be left hanging over and then you'd come to London next week, yeah?
Sir,
Are you happy with that?
Sir, that is perfect. As I understand it, we have other summaries to read in London in any event.
Yes.
So I think that if we keep to a timetable that's appropriate for you and
Well,
for the inquiry.
As I say, if we have time this afternoon, we'll hear you, but since you're good enough to stay, but otherwise it'll be London next week. Fine. Great. See you at 1:30.